In World War II, tens of millions served in the armed forces of nations around the world. From frozen battlefields in Russia to the skies over Europe and the jungles of the Pacific, danger was everywhere. But some branches of service were more lethal than others. So which was the most dangerous job in the Second World War? Infantry, submarines, bomber crews, tankers. Let's break it down by casualty rates, battlefield roles, and cold statistics. To answer the question, we'll look at two things. Casualty rates, the percentage of personnel killed or wounded in each branch. Operational conditions, the intensity and frequency of combat, exposure to enemy fire, and likelihood of survival over time. It's not just about who died in the greatest numbers, but who faced the highest odds of dying in any given role. Let's start with the most iconic and exposed, infantry. Across every nation, infantry bore the brunt of the war. Whether they were German grenadiers in the Soviet Union, British Tommies in North Africa, or American GIs in Normandy, ground troops endured brutal conditions. In the US Army, the infantry made up just 14% of the total force, but suffered over 70% of the casualties. In the Soviet Red Army, entire infantry divisions were often wiped out in weeks. Some Soviet riflemen went into battle without rifles, told to pick up weapons from the dead. German infantry divisions on the Eastern Front regularly suffered casualty rates above 60%. While they may not have had the highest percentage of deaths in all forces, frontline infantry were consistently exposed to danger, fatigue, disease, and artillery. They were the foundation of every army and the first to fall. While infantry faced daily grind and relentless pressure, one branch had the highest casualty rate in the US military: Army Air Force's bomber crews. Flying daylight raids over Nazi Germany, B-17 and B-24 crews of the 8th Air Force had an average life expectancy of 10 to 15 missions, yet a full tour required 25, later increased to 30 or more. In 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force lost over 2,800 bombers. Over 26,000 American airmen were killed in Europe, more than the entire Marine Corps lost in World War II. The odds of surviving a tour were less than 1 in 4 early in the war. They faced flak, fighter attacks, cold, mid-air collisions, and mechanical failures, and parachuting into enemy territory often meant capture or death. Bomber crews were elite, highly trained, and staggeringly vulnerable. Nowhere was death more guaranteed than underwater. The German Kriegsmarine U-boat force may have had the highest fatality rate of any major branch in the war. Of the 40,000 men who served in U-boats, nearly 28,000 died, a staggering 70% fatality rate. Entire crews would vanish without a trace. Late in the war, life expectancy on patrol was measured in weeks. Why? Advances in Allied sonar, radar, and depth charges turned the hunter into the hunted. U-boat bases were bombed. Crews endured long claustrophobic missions with little sleep, toxic air, and no margin for error. Submarine service was voluntary, and many knew they were going to their deaths. In contrast, US submariners had higher survival and were arguably more effective, sinking over 50% of Japanese merchant shipping with far fewer losses, though it was still dangerous. Next up, tank crews, especially in early war designs like the British Matilda or American Sherman. Being in a tank could be a death sentence. German panzer crews had relatively lower casualty rates early on due to better tactics and equipment. But on the Eastern Front and in Normandy, tank crews were prime targets for anti-tank guns, mines, and aircraft. When hit, tanks could explode and burn with trapped crewmen still inside, a hideous death. Soviet tankers faced the worst. In 1941 and 1942, casualty rates for Soviet tank crews often exceeded 90% in a single operation. Many tank units had little or no radio communication, Some were rushed off the factory floor into combat. Being inside a tank gave protection until it didn't. Elite units like the British SAS US Airborne and German Fallschirmjäger saw intense combat. During D-Day, the US 101st and the 82nd Airborne Division suffered over 40% casualties. German airborne troops at Crete lost over 4,000 men in one operation, so many that Hitler refused to use them in large-scale drops again. Special forces were often used in high-risk, high-value operations. They were well-trained and fiercely motivated, but their missions were incredibly dangerous. However, because their total numbers were relatively small, their high risk was less statistically devastating than bomber crews or submariners. So which branch was the most dangerous in World War II? In terms of casualty rate, the answer is clear. German U-boat crews suffered the highest proportion of deaths. 70% never returned. US bomber crews had the deadliest job in the American military. But across all nations, frontline infantry suffered the most total casualties, wounded, killed, and missing, enduring years of relentless warfare from North Africa to the Pacific. Each branch had its own version of hell, but in the end, the most dangerous job often depended on where and when you served. Which role do you think was the worst to be in during World War II? Let me know in the comments below, and please like, share, and subscribe to check out more brief summaries of the people, battles, and decisions that shaped the war.